We're just going to delay for a couple minutes. My distinguished ranking member was unavoidably detained, so we're going to wait until she gets here. Thank you. Good morning, or afternoon, I should say. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations will come to order. More than 20 years ago, the U.S. Congress approved and the President signed legislation, historic bipartisan legislation that I authored, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, a comprehensive whole-of-government initiative to combat sex and labor trafficking in the United States as well as around the world. The TVPA created a bold new domestic and international anti-human trafficking strategy and established numerous, dozens and dozens of new programs to protect victims, prosecute traffickers, and to the extent possible, prevent human trafficking in the first place. As we all know, the 3 Ps. Though it's hard to believe now, my legislation was met with a wall of skepticism and opposition, outright opposition, dismissed by many as a solution in search of a problem. The administration even argued in this room, as well as in 2172, that we didn't need a tip report, which comes out every year, that we did not need to have any sanctions or naming of countries with egregious records. It's all on the record. And that somehow all of that would be counterproductive. And I'm a great believer that when you fight human rights and combat human rights abuses, for human rights and combat abuses, you've got to name names. You've got to be specific if you hope to effectuate change. And we pressed on, again, in a bipartisan way, and we were able to get the legislation over the goal line and into law. At the time, too, many people thought when we said trafficking, including a number of U.S. attorneys that I talked to, about what were they doing. They said, you're talking about weapons, right? You're talking about drugs, right? And I said, no, we're talking about human beings. There was this sense that, what's that? Human trafficking. It was, kind of sad. I started working on this issue in 1995, and it wasn't until 5 years later that we actually got the bill enacted into law. Reports of vulnerable persons, especially women and children, being reduced to commodities for sale were often met with surprise, incredulity, or indifference. The bill was signed into law on October 28th, and within a year, and I did a number of oversight hearings as well, nobody was arguing that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and especially the 3 Ps, was flawed, unworkable, unnecessary, or especially counterproductive. Everybody seemed to then be on board. Today, we will examine child sex and labor trafficking, a particularly devastating and egregious form of human trafficking that targets the most vulnerable among us. Tragically, this heinous crime has become more prevalent in recent years. Child predators, it turns out, are everywhere, on the prowl, kidnapping, buying, or renting children to exploit. The child predators never waste a crisis and are especially skilled at taking advantage of conflict, poverty, lawlessness, poor governance by governments, corrupt officials, including at the police level, especially at the police level. They take advantage of IDPs, refugees, and migrants. During the COVID-19 pandemic, and we held a series of hearings in this committee on this, we found that child predators found new and devious ways via the internet and social media to groom and to sexually harm children. On any given day, over 27 million people around the world, and there are varying estimates, but that's one of the estimates given by the U.S. Department of State, are enslaved in forced labor or sex trafficking. It is estimated that nearly a third of all trafficking victims are children, but we believe that the true number is likely to be much, much, much higher. To combat child sex tourism in 2016, I authored the International Megan's Law. After 8 years of argument and callous disregard for child victims, it passed the House 3 times with huge bipartisan majorities, but was blocked by the Senate. International Megan's Law was finally adopted in the Senate and signed into law. International Megan's Law seeks to protect children from sex tourism by notifying destination countries when convicted pedophiles plan to travel. The penalty for failure to disclose is identical to their failure to disclose to their local state law enforcement, up to 10 years in prison. When they say, I'm going to this country, X, Y, or Z, they have to tell us that. If they lie, they can be prosecuted and, like I said, get up to 10 years in prison for it. So we're very serious. These child sex tourism, it's got to be stopped, and one way of doing it is saying, you tell us where you're going, we inform the country of destination. We have the Angel Watch program that's doing a magnificent job on that. And then they're free to say, you're not coming in, or you can come in and we'll watch you like a hawk. A number of countries, there's been more than 20,000 notices made to other countries. We've asked that it be a sense of reciprocity. We wrote it right into the law. We haven't gotten a lot of people telling us in other countries, so-and-so is coming, who we convicted as a pedophile. I wish we could get that, and we're still pushing for that so we can be on guard or make them inadmissible to the United States. Megan Kanka, on whom each and every one of our states has a Megan's Law. She was a 7-year-old little girl who lived in my old hometown of Hamilton. I know the parents very well, worked with them on Megan's Laws as well as International Megan's Law. She was sexually assaulted and murdered in 1994 by a convicted pedophile who lived across the street. Nobody, I say again, nobody knew who he was. He was actually out handing out flyers, "Have you seen Megan?" As part of the search when she went missing, and he had brutally raped her and then buried her in a shallow grave. He's in prison and hopefully will never get out. But that led to Megan's Laws everywhere. And I had a meeting about 12 years ago. I always meet with delegations when they come in, and we talk about trafficking, and this one was from Thailand. And I asked them, what would you do if you knew a convicted pedophile was coming to Bangkok or Phuket or any of the other places where child sex tourism is very, very prevalent? They said we wouldn't let him in. That day we started drafting the legislation, and again, 8 years later, we finally got it enacted into law. I just have right here, because we were very concerned that they would lie and not get caught as to where they're going. They'll say they're going to Narita, to Japan, and they're really going somewhere else, like Malaysia, or to Cambodia, or to Thailand. We got the legislation to include that the passports do have to have this inscription on it. The bearer was convicted of a sex offense against a minor and is a covered sex offender pursuing to the U.S. Code. And we know that many of the people at the border now are looking for that. They see that, and they say, get out of here. You're not coming in to abuse our children, because we know that these are very, very rampant and very often these sex tourism things are just horrible. We also know, and all of you know that, especially our very distinguished witnesses, that refugees, migrants, and internally displaced children are especially vulnerable to trafficking, and that traffickers take advantage of conflict and chaos to target young victims. We are seeing this in Ukraine, where it is estimated over 90% of the Ukrainians fleeing Putin's war are women and children, and that more than half of Ukraine's children have been displaced by conflict. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been forcibly removed from their homes and from orphanages and taken to Russia in mass abductions, part of Putin's genocidal plan to erase the Ukrainian culture. Tragically, the problems of child trafficking is rampant right here in the United States, right under our nose. A lot of our law enforcement are working hard to combat it, but it's happening right here with American children. Now we know there's a serious, well-founded concern that unaccompanied minors coming across our southern border, many from Central America and South America, may be the new victims. According to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, at least 345,000 children from other countries have crossed the U.S. southern border unaccompanied since 2021. These unaccompanied minors are especially vulnerable to traffickers, and shockingly, Department of Health and Human Services has lost contact with at least 85,000 of these children after placing them with sponsors in the United States. I would note parenthetically, and I work very closely on intercountry adoption as well as adoption domestically, there's a great vetting process to ensure that who is applying to be a parent of an adopted child gets a home study, gets all kinds of due process, due diligence to ensure they are who they are, say they are, and the child will be in a good home where he or she, or they, if it's a group of siblings, will not be hurt. What kind of due diligence is being done for these children as they're handed off? I've heard so many anecdotal stories that have just were chilling about how low the bar is in order to procure one of these children, and that's the word that I use because I think some of this obviously is human trafficking. The U.S. government has a responsibility to protect these vulnerable children and to thoroughly vet the sponsors. Without any means of contact, these children, many of whom endured countless risks to reach the U.S. border. I pointed out in our last hearing that we had with Ambassador-at-Large Dyer that the president of Guatemala told me that about 80% of the women and young girls making their way up the border, to our border, are sexually assaulted. 80%. Tim, you brought out, and I hope you bring it out in your testimony, about these other Central American presidents who are speaking out and saying, these are our kids, whether they're ultra-left or ultra-right as presidents. They're concerned that their kids are being maltreated in the most ruinous ways as they make their way to the U.S. Without any means of contact, these children, many of whom endured countless risks to reach the U.S. border, could be in immediate and grave danger and at risk of death, child sexual exploitation and abuse, severe forms of trafficking in persons, including forced labor, and of course, sex trafficking. Earlier this week, joined by 22 sponsors, I introduced H.R. 5415, the Safeguarding Endangered Children Unaccompanied and at Risk of Exploitation Act, or the SECURE Act, to compel the federal government to report on efforts to locate, establish contact with, conduct wellness checks on, and investigate any suspicion of human trafficking related to the approximately 85,000 unaccompanied minors where ORR has lost contact with. It is imperative that the executive branch locate and assess the well-being of these minors, and we must inform our border security policies, reform them so that this ends. We are joined here today by an outstanding group of witnesses, and I'll give a proper introduction to each of you. You are just amazing leaders, including a man whose life experience provided the foundation for the recently released film, The Sound of Freedom, Tim Ballard. The Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, did a premiere for members of Congress, and many members came. And even though for my wife and I, it was the second time that we saw it, I had tears in my eyes about, the heroic things that Tim did, and the kids, the plight of those kids, in this case, kids from Colombia. On May 14th, 2015, in this room, Tim Ballard testified at one of my Human Rights Committee hearings. He told us how he had served for 12 years as a special agent for the Department of Homeland Security's Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and the Sex Tourism Jump Team, and worked as an undercover operative infiltrating organizations at home and abroad that were abusing and trafficking children. Tim told us, however, that he often felt helpless, his word, by the fact that the vast majority of the child victims that we would find fell outside of the purview of the United States, and that unless we could tie it to a U.S. traveler to the case, I would not be able to rescue the children, close quote. Working with the Colombians, for example, Tim pulled off one of the largest rescue operations ever. More than 120 victims, children as young as 11, in just one day. An example of working with local law enforcement, like in Colombia, and with many of our folks that were just absolutely motivated to rescue children. 120 victims in just one day. Tim's heroic life-saving work, and it was very, very dangerous, continues to be, rescuing children from the extreme cruelty of sex trafficking, almost always at great physical risk to himself and his colleagues, is the stuff of legends. I said the other day, we often use the word hero. We use it too much, I think, sometimes in Congress. We're all legends in our own mind, after all. But this man is a hero, and you ladies are heroes on the front line, fighting so hard. The Sound of Freedom tells his true story. The film not only informs and educates, it motivates, and is going all around the world, motivating and informing people to take stronger action and to be aware situationally. I would also like to extend a very special thanks to Jeanne Celestine Lakin, a courageous survivor expert who joins us today to share her very personal perspective, what impact these crimes have on children, and what more we should be doing to prevent them. I've always considered it essential to listen to the voices of survivors. We all believe that. And in the process of developing the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it was survivors who moved the needle and convinced lawmakers that the legislation was necessary. Our bill was dead. The administration was against it. And then we had victims come and testify, including two especially persuasive women who had been forced into prostitution, trafficking in Moscow. And they told their stories. I had met with them in 1989 along with my wife, and it was just mind-boggling what they had been through. And you could have heard a pin drop when they told their stories, and people said, wait a minute, we need to do something about this. So thank you very much, Ms. Lakin. And we also, and I'm so happy to welcome, and we're deeply grateful that Jennifer Podkul, the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy of Kids in Need of Defense, will shortly testify as well, and I will introduce her more robustly in a few moments. But I want to thank you, all three of you, for your leadership. I'd like to yield to Ms. Wild.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to our witnesses. Coincidentally, the timing of this hearing is occurring just as I've returned from Nepal with several of my congressional colleagues, where we had a number of visits with young women in particular who were survivors of trafficking, as well as meeting with USAID employees and NGOs who are working very hard to combat child trafficking in particular, but also trafficking of women. And it was a very sobering trip, and it really just made me realize how extensive the problem is around the world. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned that trafficking often thrives in places of conflict and chaos. I'd add to that trafficking thrives in places with extreme poverty, which is really tragic. We spoke to people whose parents had essentially acquiesced to their young daughters being taken away for what was euphemistically called education or a job. We talked to one young woman who had survived trafficking but had been taken away from her village at age 8 and was injected with something that caused her to go into early puberty. And it was really just a terribly difficult thing to listen to. So I feel incredibly strongly that combating the scourge of human trafficking, particularly among children, but all human trafficking, should never become a partisan issue. It's one of those core priorities where we can and must continue to find common ground. We can't let this tragic issue fall into the pit where partisan divide causes important causes to be relegated to the cutting room floor, as we have seen all too often. And I hope that we can all come together in the name of humanity and decency and protection of children to cross that divide. Addressing the root of this issue requires being willing to engage in tough, robust, and effective diplomacy and partnership with partners and allies bilaterally, as well as in international forums. And one of the things we have to be prepared for is that often in countries where trafficking is particularly prevalent, there will be great denial of that at the governmental level. In very uncertain terms that it's not happening there, and we just need to be able to look past what we often do in the name of diplomacy, accepting what a government official in another country tells us, to really look at what is happening around the world. And it requires consistency in how we report on countries, regardless of geopolitical considerations. We cannot show favoritism in this issue to countries that we may have an allied relationship with because we're worried about upsetting a balance of trade or some other issue. It's absolutely too important, and this issue, in my view, supersedes all other considerations. And it requires being willing to take on powerful interests here at home, quite honestly, particularly when it comes to some disturbing recent reports that we have seen of the prevalence of child labor in corporate supply chains, including among some very profitable corporations doing business here in the United States. And I don't mean to suggest that we are at the heart of the problem, but I think it's very, very important that we not close our eyes to any evidence of child trafficking in particular, human trafficking in general. So to all the advocates and the survivors who may be watching this hearing, wherever you are, please know that you have an ally in me and my office and this subcommittee. With that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working together on this, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I say to the ranking member, I'd like to yield such time as you may consume to Ms. Radowagen, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the ranking member for holding this important hearing. Mr. Ballard, I have several questions for you, but they're all sort of interwoven. But let's start by, can you tell us more about what you learned about the crime of child trafficking as an agent for the Department of Homeland? Oh, I'm sorry. Erase all that. But I wanted to just take the opportunity to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this tremendously important hearing, and I particularly want to thank the witnesses for appearing here today to share all this very, very important information with us.
Okay, I'd like to yield to Ms. Manning.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to Ranking Member Wild. Thank you for your remarkable words on this critically important and heartbreaking problem. And Chairman Smith, I would just like to thank you for your many, many years of tenacious work on this issue, more than 20 years of work. And I just want to congratulate you on your achievements, because I think without your work, we would not have some of the laws in place that are hopefully having an effect on getting to this issue. So thank you for all of that. I guess I want to start with Ms. Podkul. Can you talk to us about how has human trafficking evolved world? Oh. Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning, and thank you, Ranking Member Wild. Let me introduce our three distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Tim Ballard, who's Senior Advisor to the SPEAR Fund, which combats all forms of human trafficking. Mr. Ballard previously spent over a decade working as a special agent, some of the background I already shared with the committee and with the audience, where he was assigned to the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and an undercover operative. And again, I would encourage people to watch The Sound of Freedom to get a sense of what it is really like to be on the front line, to plan, to do all of the intel that was necessary, how to best rescue those children with the greatest possibility of them, and as well as the rescuers not getting hurt. I mean, the traffickers think nothing of committing murder. They rape, they also murder. So I'm so grateful, but I hope people will take the time to look at that and watch that very, very powerful movie. Then we'll hear from Jeanne Celestine Lakin, who is a survivor of the child trafficking and an expert on the vulnerability of children to trafficking and the impact that it has on their growth and development, and what could be done to protect and prevent this crime. Ms. Lakin serves as the chair of the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And parenthetically, I serve as the special representative for the Parliamentary Assembly trafficking as the special rep. So, you know, she's a colleague as well, but working with ODIHR, and deeply appreciate that work. She's an award-winning author of A Voice in the Darkness, a memoir of a Rwandan genocide, and it's just, I just got a copy and I will read it, probably in October when we have a break. And she wrote as a survivor of the genocide in Rwanda. We all remember the Tutsis and Hutus and the horrible bloodletting that may have been prevented, but it wasn't, by the international community, the UN, and the United States. But she's a survivor, so it's thank you for being here. She obtained her MA in Public Administration and Public Policy from Eastern Washington University. She founded the 1 Million Orphans initiative dedicated to providing sustainable support to the world's most vulnerable children. Then we'll hear from Jennifer Podkul, who is the international human rights lawyer and expert on child migration in the United States. Prior to joining Kids in Need of Defense, Jennifer was a senior program officer at the Women's Refugee Commission, where she researched issues facing vulnerable migrants seeking protection in the United States and advocated for improved treatment. She is a national expert on issues affecting immigrant children, has published articles, handbooks, and reports on U.S. immigration law, and she presents regularly as an expert at various conferences, briefings, and professional trainings, and include that speaking to us here on the subcommittee. Thank you. She co-authored Forced from Home, The Lost Boys and Girls from Central America, and was a contributing author to Childhood Migration and Human Rights in Central and North America, Causes, Policies, Practices, and Challenges. Thank you. Each of you, please take up to 10 minutes. If you need a little more, that's fine. And any additional materials you want to be included in the record without objection will be so ordered.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Wild, and members of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, it's an honor to present to you this statement. Human trafficking is real, it's tragic, and I'm grateful that this committee is willing to bring attention to how human trafficking is the largest and fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world, how the United States actors have played a role in that growth, and what we can do to end trafficking in our time. Human trafficking is a global humanitarian crisis, with the U.S. State Department estimating that there are over 27 million global victims of human trafficking at any given time. Tragically, some people in the media and in Washington, D.C., have tried to minimize the impact of human trafficking and the destruction it creates, especially in the lives of innocent children. But regardless of ideology or party label, I believe every member of this committee and good people everywhere can agree that human trafficking is a plague and an evil that must be eradicated. Evidence of this can be seen in the response to the new movie Sound of Freedom that has been a surprise box office success and is sparking a national conversation on child sex slavery and trafficking. The American people on all sides of the aisle are realizing that ending human trafficking is not a political debate. It is the moral imperative of our time, and our nation is not alone in this mindset. In my career, I have traveled extensively around the globe, most recently for the international release of the film Sound of Freedom. I have met with heads of states and government officials in countries we count as close allies who share with great sadness the impact and the scourge that human trafficking is having on their own borders. They understand the magnitude of the evil that trafficking represents and share their strong conviction to work with the United States in bringing powerful solutions to the fight against human trafficking. The conclusions I offer today in this testimony are based on my professional experience as an anti-trafficking operator, both as a U.S. federal agent and the leader of an anti-trafficking NGO. After starting my professional career with the CIA, I transferred to the Department of Homeland Security. At DHS, I spent 12 years as a special agent and an undercover operator for Homeland Security investigations. For 10 of those years, I combated sex trafficking on the southern border and became one of the country's foremost experts on the issue of trafficking through years of undercover work and research and investigation. After leaving the federal government, I've continued the fight against human trafficking, first as the founder and CEO of the anti-trafficking organization Operation Underground Railroad, also as the CEO of the Nazarene Fund, and now as a senior advisor for the Spear Fund, which is an organization that funds and collaborates with a coalition of experts, operators, organizations, and concerned citizens around the globe to end human trafficking. Through my experience as a federal agent and working with several of these NGOs, I have worked closely with the heads of every U.S. agency whose job it is to find and rescue children being trafficked across our border, as well as working with government officials and law enforcement agencies from around the world. Both our federal agents and local law enforcement, along with anti-trafficking agents around the globe, work with professionalism and dedication. Their tireless efforts result in not just disrupting the flow of human trafficking, but rescuing those who have become victims of human trafficking. I would like to share two recent experiences that highlight the role the U.S. currently shares in aiding human trafficking in the world, while also showing what is possible if we redouble our efforts and lead other countries in the fight against human trafficking. First, the United States is generally understood to be the #1 consumer of child exploitation material in the world, and a major contributor to the abhorrent sex tourism agency around the globe. And policies here at home have a ripple effect throughout the world. Earlier this month, I had the heartbreaking conversations with President Castro in Honduras and President Giamatti in Guatemala. It was clear from my conversations with each president that U.S. policies are forcing our neighbors into crisis. The leadership in these pathway countries are working hard to warn their people against the dangerous practice of submitting to smugglers and traffickers. However, contrary to their pleas, the current administration's policies make it too alluring, and the smugglers or traffickers who can make up to $14 million a day are way too convincing. So alluring and convincing, in fact, that the Council on Foreign Relations reported that the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras account for 3/4 of unaccompanied children apprehended at the southern U.S. border in fiscal year 2022. Sadly, U.S. government policy is currently reinforcing those numbers, creating havoc and making the anti-trafficking efforts of countries like Honduras and Guatemala more difficult. In contrast to this, recent operation efforts not covered widely in the news show it was possible with close international cooperation between multiple governments and NGOs. During the early days of the Russian invasion, I was alerted about women and children who were being victimized and being trafficked outside of Ukraine. For human traffickers, geopolitical events like natural disasters or like the war in Ukraine are sometimes and sickeningly referred to as harvest time by the traffickers because of their ability to easily prey upon vulnerable women and children. After recognizing the need in Ukraine, I began looking for an NGO that was on the ground in Ukraine, that had the legal right to be there and had strong working relationships with the locals and was and with the local government and the proper authorities. Little did I know at the time that leads uncovered during our work in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe would lead to a rescue operation represented by several NGOs, including Operation Underground Railroad, Aerial Recovery, Free a Girl, and other organizations, which because of operational security can't be named at this time. I led this operation beginning in Ukraine. We went through 3 continents, 6 countries, and we identified a pedophile organization, actually a political organization of organized pedophiles in Holland who were fugitives, and they were hiding in Latin America while working to smuggle war victim children into their arms and into the possibility of being trafficked in these countries. We were able to identify the leader of this group, and he was hiding in Mexico City working with Mexican officials. He was arrested last summer, and that led us to find his lieutenants, also fugitives from Holland for crimes against children, who had stood up a sex hotel in a little village called Canoa in Ecuador, working with the National Police of Ecuador and with the U.S. Embassy, HSI, who supported greatly in this operation. We were able to dismantle that organization completely, and both those pedophiles have been convicted and are serving significant prison sentences in Ecuador. We also identified 2 other Dutch pedophiles, part of this group, that we worked to get them back to their country where they are facing the charges there as well. All this we did in 4 short months and was able to rescue 900 orphans out of Ukraine during the invasion. The only way we could do this was by private-public partnerships. Multiple NGOs, multiple government organizations, government agencies, all working together. That's how you move fast. That's how you rapidly rescue and protect children. But make no mistake, the war against human trafficking cartels and their allies, it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult. It's a hard fight, but I believe we can win if we work together. The first step in that fight is ensuring U.S. policies make human trafficking more difficult and not easier. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the plight of 85,000 unaccompanied immigrant children that, according to HHS, were in the government's care, handed over to sponsors with minimal vetting, and now cannot be accounted for. We have, in large part, thanks to the whistleblower in HHS, Ms. Rodas, who's here. I was so happy and surprised to see her here. It's thanks to her heroic efforts and courage to stand up and sound the alarm about what was happening, that these children were being released way too rapidly and without the proper vetting. Congressman Smith's The Secure Act, in particular, will help find these kids that this administration has claimed on record that it's not their problem anymore, despite these children being at great risk of sexual abuse and other forms of exploitation. Secondly, the U.S. can redouble our commitment in the international enforcement efforts. The presidents of Guatemala and Honduras both shared the value they see in policies like International Megan's Law, which allows the U.S. to alert our allies when registered sex offenders are entering their countries. In fact, I told both presidents, I didn't bring it up, Chairman, they brought it up. And they said, that law, International Megan's Law, wow, thank you. And I said, well, I know the person who wrote that and sponsored that. In fact, I had the privilege to actually testify before Congress. And they were so proud, and they gave me the numbers of how many alerts they're getting from the U.S. government. And they know it's preventing child sex abuse. And so from the presidents of both Honduras and Guatemala, they sent me to thank you, Chairman Smith and all those who sponsored that bipartisan bill, because it's saving lives. And it taught me an important lesson. What you do in the halls of Congress, despite what others might say, actually does work, actually can do tremendous work in saving lives. And so all the more reason to be here and to continue to support this next piece of legislation, the Secure Act. As I shared earlier, the United States is generally understood to be the #1 consumer of child sexual exploitation material in the world and a major contributor to the abhorrent sex tourism industry around the globe. Now it is up to us to solve this problem. Too often people say in this country, this is a problem far, far away. This is a problem that we have nothing to do with. Well, that's not true. Not only are we, according to State Department in the TIP report, we're in the top 3 countries for destination countries for human trafficking. We create so much of the demand. We so often are the tourists abusing children, so it is our problem, and we must solve that problem right here. Countries around the world, in fact, are looking to us and looking to you to solve this problem and end this horrific plague that really is the slavery of children. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Ballard. I would note parenthetically, when you did testify in 2015, you gave our bill a major, major boost. Given your background, when you said pass it, because it had passed the House 3 times, it did help over in the Senate, so thank you.
Well, thank you.
Ms. Lakin.
Chairman Chris Smith, Ranking Member Susan Wild, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you here today. My name is Jeanne Celestine Lakin, and I'm deeply honored to be here as a witness in the subcommittee hearing on child trafficking. I would like to express my gratitude to the subcommittee for addressing this critical issue on child trafficking and its devastation impact it has on children, particularly children of refugees. I testify here before you today as a proud American, also as a survivor of child trafficking and a survivor of Rwandan genocide against Tutsis. I am one of the lucky ones who found safety here in the United States after losing my family and also losing my home and experiencing the depth of inhumanity and suffered unimaginable violence. I call on all of you to ensure that children who are coming from armed conflict are protected from human trafficking. I also want to call on all of you to implement policies, especially immigration reform, that really embodies humanity. I believe that we all should protect our borders, yes, but also to look at the people who are crossing the borders or people who are fleeing the conflicts as we see it today. When I came to the United States, I was a 14-year-old, but it took me about 14 years to actually become a US citizen. And that is just such a long time waiting. A lot of people are exploited during that phase because they wait without documentation and they're vulnerable. And that's women and children. I come to you with true faith that as decision makers in this room, that you will do everything in your power to ensure that children are protected from human trafficking, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. Especially, again, looking at the war-torn countries, looking at those countries where they have conflicts, where children are fleeing, where women are fleeing, and girls. The Bible in Psalms 82, verse 3 to 4 tells us, "Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them in the hands of the wicked." I believe in this Bible verse. I live by it every day, and that's why I'm sitting here today testifying, and that is why I chartered 1 Million Orphans. Will you join me to create laws and implementing policies to protect children who are scarred by the loss of their mothers, and the children who have been scarred by the loss of their fathers, and the children who traffickers seek to make profit off their little bodies? I have faith that we can restore their faith if we all come together in the sake of humanity. And the best way to do this is really to have a place in a place or system to support people who have been victimized. A lot of times people don't realize that for me as a survivor, not only was I raped, but I was also traumatized from what I've seen. So we need to find a system that supports, that addresses mental health for the victims as well, also for the survivors. UNODC in 2020 Global Report on Human Trafficking estimated that 65% of trafficked were women and girls. And in 92% of those individuals were trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And again, you're looking at more women and girls. We know that in Rwanda, for example, rape was used as a weapon of war. It is the same thing that is happening in Congo right now. It's the same thing that is happening in Ukraine. It's the same thing that is happening in South Sudan. More so to say, when women are fleeing, they leave, when they are being trafficked, they're leaving behind those vulnerable children. I had many opportunities to speak to women who are fleeing Ukraine, and their bravery, their courage, but they speak about their husbands fighting in a war, or their husbands who have been killed. But they talk about also the journey to making to a safe place and how tough that's been. And those women and girls are even more so vulnerable. As a chair of OSC, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights International Survivor of Trafficking Advisory Council, also known as ISTAC, I serve with 20 other members, survivor members. And today, I am here to represent all of them. Those survivors have encountered inhumanity, but they speak, they work to make sure that they make a difference in the world. One of my suggestions for the group is, there was a book that was put together, the National Reform Mechanism by Survivors. And that book, I believe, that should be in every single country, really, because it puts out a framework and also ways to identify and way to provide resources to support survivors and victims. I also want to bring this attention to OSC region on child trafficking. According to 2020 UNODC Global Report on Human Trafficking in Persons, 40% of all global human trafficking cases occurred in OSC region. I want you to pay attention to this number. Out of that 40%, 27% were the cases on children. Human trafficked children, 27%. Girls represented 16%, and 11% represented the boys. While human trafficking, a lot of times we talk about labor trafficking and also sexual exploitation, a lot of times we miss that in this report, 10% of those that were trafficked, 10% of those children were trafficked for the sake of harvesting their organs, and many of them do not survive. So we see that children in institutions, children who are in alternative care, runaway youth, unaccompanied children, separated children, children with disabilities, children who belong to national minorities such as Romas and Sintis, childless children, and also children with in armed conflict. All of these children become very vulnerable, and we need to find a way to be united behind them. I also want to bring this tragedy to highlight the tragedy that I've seen coming from Ukraine, of course. That's been forced deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. As a mother, I cannot fathom not seeing my boy again. Many of these children have been indoctrinated against Ukraine, and some of them have had their document changed, and they have been adopted by Russia. These children are not going to be able to reunite with their families. Before I share my lived experience, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Chairman Smith for leading the way in uniting OSC states and protecting Ukrainian women and children. Thank you for the work you do. Your unwavering commitment and leadership in combating human trafficking here in the United States and around the world is truly remarkable and has made such an impact and is going to continue to make an impact. So as survivors of human trafficking, we want to thank you, Chairman Smith, for the work that you are doing today. I want to share my story really quick, but I want you to know that my story is not a unique story. It is a story of a Ukrainian girl. It is a story of an Afghan girl or a boy. It is a story of many children around the world. It's a story of refugee boys and girls fleeing from different places like Ethiopia, South Sudan, or boys fleeing from Venezuela, or a little girl fleeing from Myanmar. I grew up in a Christian family. I had 10 siblings. My parents really served the community. They embodied the humanity. They served tirelessly to the community. But when 1994 genocide came knocking on our doors, my parents were, I don't want to say it this way, but I believe they were a bit naive. They didn't believe, because of the work they've done in a community, they believed that we would be safe. The propaganda campaign were on the radios, they were on television. The ideology of hate. We went from being part of the human family to being called things like cockroaches and snakes and everything else except humans. We have been dehumanized. And one of the things, again, I advocate for in terms of immigration reform, as I was filling out forms before I received my US citizenship, when you fill out forms that says you are alien, for me that was trigger. Because in my own country, I was called the alien, the other. So as decision makers, policy makers, I will call on all of you to change those forms. People should not be referred to as aliens. But in the course of 3 months in 1994, my parents divided us in groups of 3 children. I ended up with 3 old twin sisters. We lived in the bushes, in the swamps. We ate plants, we ate grass, drank rainwater. While all around us, we heard killers inciting things to kill us because we were supposed to be snakes and cockroaches. At the end of the genocide, actually before the genocide, I had witnessed my father being killed with machetes in the streets. My father was my hero. Before the end of the genocide, I had seen witnessed my mother's dead body and my 3-week-old little brother. Give me a moment, I'm sorry. Thank you. At the end of the genocide, I was captured by a man who not only physically abused me, but verbally and sexually raped me as a 9-year-old. This man decided that he would actually migrate to Congo with me. And it was in the Congo where he was negotiating with adult men how much money I was worth to be sold into marriage. And at that time, I was 10 years old. I ran back from Congo, made it to Rwanda. I grew up in a family where I had everything a child could have dreamed of. My parents were business people. But at the end of the genocide, I was a homeless kid in the street, begging. So as you make policies, as you write laws, keep in mind the human aspect. Keep that embodiment of humanity as you make these decisions. Because girls like myself, children like myself, should not go through what I had to go through. Came here to United States. I was placed with a family who also sexually abused me as well. So if it wasn't once, I was like, God, how much more can I take? But I'm here because I believe that we have to be the voice of the voiceless. And Chairman Smith, I appreciate what you said about vetting system. We need to have screening system to where families who are receiving migrant children are vetted, just like families that are adopting. Because it's easy to say you might have the same DNA, you're somehow matching DNA or related to this person, but it doesn't mean that person is a safe place for a child. And that's something that really people need to look into. Another thing that I really would encourage you to do is to really, as you make these policies and these decisions, to have survivors like myself be in a room, because I believe lived experience speak volumes. And by giving me a platform today, you have given a voice to countless survivors and victims today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Lakin, for your courage, for your wisdom, your resiliency, your faith. You were truly an inspiration. Thank you so very much. I'd like to now yield to our final witnesses, and thank you for your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Wild. My name is Jennifer Podkul. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at Kids in Need of Defense. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about KIND's mission to ensure the protection of unaccompanied and separated children. Early in my legal career, I solely represented trafficked children on their complex legal matters. My clients were from around the world. They were from Mexico, Russia, Thailand, and they had survived brutal exploitation as domestic servants, some as farm workers, and some in the sex industry. All of these cases had one thing in common. Close collaboration between experts was key to ensuring that these children were safe, that they could begin their healing, and that they could thrive in their communities. In my current role at KIND, I have the honor of working with attorneys and social workers around the world, implementing through partnerships a child-focused iteration of the 3 Ps, the prevention, prosecution, and protection, that's outlined in Mr. Smith's landmark bill, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. As you've seen in my written testimony, my colleagues are doing tremendous work in Mexico and in Europe to collaborate with government officials, law enforcement officers, and child protection professionals to prevent child trafficking and then to serve survivors. Prevention of child trafficking is a priority, as by the time we have to intervene, children have already experienced harm. In KIND's experience, prevention work requires meaningful relationship building to identify and then to work to reduce children's vulnerabilities. Right? We're conducting trainings and partnering with community-based organizations in Central America, Mexico, and Europe to provide children with information about their rights and how to seek assistance if ever necessary. Although we've made progress on many fronts, there's more that needs to be done to protect children. First, as set forth in the TVPA, the US government should make every measure to ensure kids are connected to attorneys. Having been the only trusted adult in a child's life when I served as their attorney, I can tell you that counsel is a crucial tool to identifying and helping a child that's being exploited or who's at risk. Second, the government should institute safe return and reintegration programming that's outlined in the TVPRA for unaccompanied children who can safely return to their countries of origin. Integration services can decrease the likelihood that a child will be compelled to attempt another dangerous journey to the United States. Third, to ensure unaccompanied children are screened at the border for trafficking concerns, the Department of Homeland Security should assign state-licensed child welfare professionals to help administer those screenings. I applaud Representative Salazar and Representative Jacobs' bipartisan leadership in ensuring that proper funding for child welfare professionals is in the fiscal year 24 budget. Fourth, the administration should immediately ramp up, and Congress should provide the necessary resources for the Central American Minors Program. This is in-country processing program. It enables certain vulnerable children to apply for potential relocation to the U.S. as refugees. This is a lifeline for children who are in danger, who may otherwise have no choice but to make the hazardous trek to the U.S.-Mexico border. Fifth and finally, the U.S. should increase funding for programs that prioritize building capacity abroad. As an example, KIND and its partners in Europe have supported efforts to provide refugee children and families services at coordinated support hubs, otherwise known as Blue Dots. They've been created by government authorities in partnership with UNICEF and UNHCR. At these sites, children can register with protection authorities and receive basic needs. They get legal information, and then they can get help with family reunification. This model should be replicated in other areas of the world. This is a very difficult topic, and there are a lot of very tragic stories that we all hear doing this work every day. So I just want to end my testimony with a story. A few years ago, I was in National Airport, and I heard somebody yell my name. So much to my surprise, a young woman came running at me, and I realized it was a former client of mine. So this girl, who had become a delightful woman, had come into my office seeking help when she was a child. And at the time, she didn't even realize that the horrors that she was experiencing had a name. It was human trafficking. So during our joyful reunion in the airport, I learned that due to the hard work put in by my social work colleague, the intrepid prosecutor who was willing to go after a diplomat who was exploiting her, and this girl's bravery and tenacity, she had been able to craft this life that was filled with formal education, dignified work, and limitless possibilities. It's a reminder that when children are given the chance at safety and security, their resilience knows no bounds. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for your leadership and for making such a difference. Begin some of the questions. Ms. Lakin, you talked about the importance of faith. I was visiting a shelter, a Christian shelter in Goma, in DR Congo, where virtually every woman there had been raped, often gang raped, by these paramilitaries and by government troops. And the transition within their hearts and souls, the trauma doesn't go away, but the ability to cope and overcome and have renewed hope and faith does when there's faith involved. I met a number of the women. I spent hours talking to them, almost all listening. I didn't ask questions. They just spoke, and I took notes. And their lives were restored, but obviously with a huge, huge trauma that, like I said, never goes away, like you deal with such agony as well. In the help that we do provide, the shelters, I've been in shelters all over the world, in Bolivia, in El Salvador, in Ethiopia, faith-based shelters. In Peru, they have a number of shelters there. And I've always been incredibly impressed, and I often get into arguments with some of the people at the OSCE, not you, that they think that having a faith-based component, which, psychologists can do great work, psychiatrists can do great work, social workers, great work, but almost like with Alcoholics Anonymous, there is that next step where faith in God certainly helps to overcome and to find a new way forward. And the outcomes are so much better when there's a faith-based component. And yet there's hostility to that among many. One of my counterpart in the OSCE years ago, I'm with the Parliamentary Assembly for the OSCE, she was with the OSCE itself, was openly hostile to faith-based component. And I said, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or any other faith, but having that comfort that comes with it. So if you could maybe speak to that as part of the healing process, because what I've learned from, every law we write and every bill, every initiative is trauma informed, and you are informing us again, as you have been doing, and others. When you get to the healing process, it seems to me without that, that next step doesn't happen. And I too love the Psalms. Psalm 82 is a great one, and 73 and 37 are two of my favorite. And for those who have been so horrifically injured, even David said that he almost lost his way until he came into the sanctuary of the Lord. Then he learned, what would happen to them, and that God does hold you in the palm of his hand, even though it doesn't seem like it so often. So if you could speak to that part of the healing ministry that's so needed for trafficking.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. That is very important. It was also very important for me to, after the genocide, the way I describe the way I walked out of that genocide, I had survived, but I was mentally dead. Like The Walking Dead, not the movie, but literally my soul was dead because everything that I had witnessed. And I battled depression, PTSD, trauma, you name it. I could have taken every pill on the market. Nothing would have been able to help me except the way God saved me. I grew up again in a Christian family where the value of faith was very, very important. And I remember just having this conversation with God because I was like, God, you saved me, but I feel like I am dead inside. And I was like, why would I have survived such tragedy to be walking around with a dead spirit to the point I couldn't feel? When you walk outside, you feel the sunshine and you feel joy. There was no joy in my heart. I felt like I had descended, basically hit rock bottom after surviving. And so I spent time praying and asking God to free me. And that's why I feel like really shelters that are faith-based are the most helpful, because counseling is great, and I encourage people to seek counseling for professional work. But having that touch with our Creator is so powerful beyond what most people can imagine. When I prayed and I asked God to free me, He said, directly through the Holy Spirit, He said, forgive them. So clearly, forgive the people who have raped you, the people who have done a number on me, the people who have killed my family. Forgive them. And I say, God, I do not have the capability to forgive such inhumane. But if you want me to forgive, I want you to give me the strength to be able to do that. And I honestly, when I said that back to God, He gave me the strength where I said, I forgive you for raping me. I forgive you for killing my family. I forgive you for the reasons that I am an orphan, helpless in the streets. And I felt like as if I was flying high in the sky. That was the freedom. And so I do encourage to have faith-based organizations supporting this. People have been broken to where we cannot see. I serve as a manager of disability services at the college in Texas. When we don't see the physical disability, we assume people are fine. But there's a lot of disability that we may not be able to see. There's a lot of brokenness that only God can heal. Thank you.
Thank you. Since we will have votes around 1:40, I understand. I have a lot of questions, but I'll just do one now and then yield to my colleagues. And this would be to Mr. Ballard. We had Cindy Dyer, a master at large for trafficking. And again, I wrote the law that created that position, and I have great respect for her. And she gave tremendous testimony. But I did say before she came in that I'm going to ask you about the 85,000 unaccompanied minors that have gone missing under the administration's watch. And I asked her that question after, I'm not a got you kind of chairman. I want real answers, so I told her beforehand I was going to ask it. And she didn't know. She said, call Homeland Security. We've called Homeland Security, but you don't get any answers. So we have this bill, as you know, and you were very much a part of helping to draft it, and I thank you, Mr. Ballard, called the Secure Act, which would penalize the FBI, Homeland Security, and HHS for unobligated funds, but money in their bank account, $100,000 a day if they do not provide every 60 days a very important report on exactly what they're doing to do the welfare and whereabouts of these children. And it seems to me that, how dare we look the other way or that was on May 12th we had that hearing. We've been reaching out nonstop, and it's crickets. And it drives me a little bit crazy to think these kids could be sexually exploited as we're meeting here, or labor or sex trafficking. So your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a lot of thoughts on this. I first think of I have 2 adopted children who are migrants from Haiti. I have 7 biological and 2 adopted. These are 2 children that we rescued in February of 2014 from a trafficking organization. And we decided, my wife and I, to bring them home and adopt these 2 of the 28. I was shocked and even a little frustrated, though I shouldn't have been, at the process that the State Department put us through to be vetted, to receive 2 precious children. I appreciated it. I thought, wow, the U.S. government really cares. They really care to make sure. I saved them, for heaven's sakes. And I didn't get any shortcuts. Home studies, background checks. And I thought, this is wonderful how we as a nation value the lives of foreign children, even foreign children who are coming into our homes. I think of what would happen having worked in law enforcement in some capacity for 20 years. I can tell you, if a child unaccompanied showed up in New York City or Washington, D.C., or you name the city, and that child showed up unaccompanied, alone, well, what would happen to that child? If once the authorities were notified, that child would be protected. I know this. I've watched them do it. If someone comes and says, I'm the sponsor or guardian of this kid, they're not going to release that kid. We're talking again, background checks, DNA testing, extensive research, because this is a precious child of God. So the question I have for the administration, why would you not afford the same protections to a foreign child who's inside of our country? I don't care how they got there. It's past. Let's worry about that later. They're here. They're here right now. Why on earth would you not afford the same protections? I've seen the process. I've been on the border. I was 10 years as a special agent there. I've been there since that time, watching what happens. These children have to be released. And by the way, the people I've talked to that wear the uniform, the people at HHS, they don't like it either. I've talked to them. Talked to Ms. Rodas about it. She works there. They don't like it. They don't like that they are, by mandate, by policy, forced to pick up the phone and call a number that's the sponsor. And they don't like that they have to use taxpayer dollars to then send that child to the unvetted sponsor, not knowing whether or not they are in fact part of the final leg of a child trafficking experience. Why is the suicide rate up higher than ever at Border Patrol? Because they are being asked and even compelled to be part of a child sex delivery service. That's where we're at right now. This needs to stop. And we can do it. The Secure Act is the best first step here. We need to do it, and we do it, and we need to do it now. I was with the president of Honduras last week, President Castro, amazing woman. She wept as she told the stories. The very next day, I was with President Jeanne in Guatemala. Now, here's what's interesting. Children over politics. That's how it should be. I think in this country, it's politics over children. President Castro is a devout socialist. President Jeanne is a devout conservative. And they said the same thing to me. That didn't matter at all. What mattered was the lives of children. President Castro is heading up to the border in a few weeks. There's 3,000 children from Honduras that are in the care of HHS. She's scared to death of their plight. She wants us to find their families. I agree with her. I don't care if the families are in the U.S. or outside the U.S. Reunite them with their families. And she said, well, the administration is telling me, don't worry, they're getting fed, they're getting educated. She's like, I want them to be with their moms and dads. That's where I want them. Or find a loving home for them somewhere else if there is no mom and dad. She's coming up to the border. I was so proud of her. And with tears, she said this to me. President Gutierrez, Giamatti told me about a program he's launched called Haciendo Visible lo Invisible, which is to say, making visible what is invisible. And it's a warning to the people, don't go with the slick salesman coyotes. They give a good pitch. Oh, you can't pay now? You can pay later. Yeah, with your body, which we're not going to tell you about until maybe you get to around, Guatemala or Mexico and close to the border. And then after that, who knows what's going to happen to you. But don't worry, there's a sponsor who will pick you up. This is sick. That we are participating as a country in this is sick.
Ms. Wild, thank you very much. Ms. Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Podkul, I read your testimony with great interest and listened to what you had to say today, particularly your references to this Blue Dot program that KIND has implemented, along with, I understand, partners in Europe have also assisted. And based on your testimony, I understand that these sites are situated at different border locations to best serve children who are fleeing or displaced by the situation in Ukraine, where they can register with protection authorities, can receive some basic necessities, medical aid, information counseling, and assistance in locating and reunifying with family. Can you quantify in any way how successful this program has been in assisting vulnerable Ukrainian children? And it doesn't have to be in terms of numbers, but give us an idea of how effective this has been.
Sure. Let me describe kind of what it looks like, because when I went to the Romanian border with Ukraine as soon as the war broke out to see what was going on, right? We knew women and children could leave and men could not. So we went to see, are there separated children? What's happening to children on the move? So when I was there, you cross into the border into Romania. This was at a time of chaos, right? This was at the very beginning of everything. Lots of people leaving as quickly as they could get out. There was a host of services that had been set up. So there were tents, and there was all different kinds of people and churches, individuals wanting to help, and a lot of good-hearted people, not necessarily official organizations, but a lot of good-hearted people. Probably also a lot of nefarious people there as well, and it was just a lot of chaos. And so people coming out, they were tired, they were hungry, the kids needed snacks, so it was important to get help to them. And it was confusing, who's the right person to go to, which tent do I go to? There's all these people offering to help. So the blue dot is, intended to be kind of a physical, something that people can see easily and know that these are run by UN agencies, that these are trusted partners and entities. And it's a physical space. So it's like you can go inside so people aren't harassing you, right? You don't have people just walking up to you, hey, I can help you, hey, I can get you a hotel room, right? You're safe, it's quiet, you can charge your phone, you can get oriented, these are the rules and policies in this country. This is how you would register with the Child Protection Agency. What do you need?
And is this
What
only
questions do you
unaccompanied
have?
minors?
It's for children and families.
Okay.
So families can take advantage of this too. So it's funded and supported by UNHCR, the refugee agency, and UNICEF, the UN agency to protect children. So they do this jointly, and then they collaborate with groups. So for example, we have colleagues who are working in those to provide the legal assistance. And so to give information, what is your right? The child should have a guardianship, right? They're allowed to have temporary protection right now throughout Europe. They're allowed to enroll in school. So they need to understand what their options are. So these kinds of hubs, it's a way to make sure that in a moment of chaos, somebody is very clear who are the safe actors, what are their rights, what's available to them, so that they get put into the registration systems and referral systems that these countries are setting up. Because we all know, right, the exploitation, it thrives in the shadows and in darkness. And so getting kids into these official systems and channels is going to be the best protection for them.
So my follow-up to that is this Blue Dot process being used elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so it actually started before the
Right,
Ukraine
in 2008,
emergency.
right?
Exactly. Later in 2000s, it's in different places in Europe, and I think right now the question is where else could we be implementing this, knowing there's so many children on the move?
And so that was my question. Is it being used at all in Central America?
I don't know of any Blue Dot facilities that are set up in Central America. There's a virtual version of it, so people who have mobile phones can get at least some information. There are other entities and programs in which governments are collaborating with service providers to do similar things. I use this as an example because this was funded by UN agencies, and so they have, kind of a global perspective on best practices, which has been particularly useful.
And how critical has the role of UNICEF and UNHRC been in this work?
It's been incredibly important. I mean, they're able to bring, authority and work with governments to really identify best practices. When you have entities, civil society organizations, and international organizations like these UN organizations, they have an understanding of best practices and also how to collaborate with each government, right? Each government is going to have their own system and their own laws, so they're going to know in that local context what are the available protections. And so it's very important that they're able to expand their services to meet the demand, right? We know the number of children on the move is incredibly high all over the world. And so in order for them to be fully resourced to do this in all places and respond to children
Well,
is very
that's why I was
important.
asking you, because I saw evidence of the great work they were doing in Nepal also, and it does occur to me that it would be very useful to have them on the ground in Central America, given what we know to be a crisis there. And I'm very deeply concerned about reductions in funding to those agencies, which I think would greatly affect their ability to provide these services from everything I understand. So I hope that we will continue to provide funding. I think this hearing is a really good example of why certain forms of foreign aid are so essential. I mean, we often have to justify foreign aid to taxpayers and otherwise, but I think that this kind of hearing sheds light on where a lot of that foreign aid is going. So thank you very much. With that, I'm going to yield back for the moment. I know we have votes coming up, so.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to the chairwoman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Maria Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's laudable, and I congratulate you for putting this hearing together. And to Mr. Ballard, you were the guy, I watched the movie 3-4 years ago, the first cut in Miami, Florida, and you really caused a major impression. It's a thorn in my back that I've had ever since I learned about this phenomenon that we just do not know about. This movie has put this issue in the forefront, and we have to thank you. May the Lord pay it back to you in health, to your 10 children, because this is, there are no words to describe, and I think Chairman Smith and myself, we are committed to do something about it, whatever that is. And to you, Ms. Jeanne, Celestine, thank you for sharing your pain with us. Mrs. Jennifer, for wanting to help those kids. So I have many questions. I know that we're going to be called for votes at any time, but I introduced an immigration reform recently, the only immigration reform law that has been presented in Congress this cycle, and it's basically an immigration bill. And one of the main topics that I addressed, thanks to the movie, is to impose a minimum penalty of 25 years to those who are convicted of child sex trafficking. That's one thing. The other one is to give a better, more rigorous training to the Border Patrol agents in trying to spot where those child sex traffickers are. It's specifically including what you said about that just because they give you a phone number, you're giving the child back to the trafficker. We are the United States of America. What? So not only that, taking care of our own agents, but then going to the transnational criminals, the smugglers, the back where it starts, and creating processing centers to weed out and come to the conclusion whether that's the uncle or the father. So basically, the Dignity Act, I just want you to remember it. I want to work with you because everyone talks about the mess at the border and that we're having all this illegals and fentanyl and everything coming in, but not everyone mentions the child sex traffickers. And unfortunately, no one says either that we're the #1 market. So that means that we have, the consumers are here among us. That's another, that's no words to describe it in a public hearing in the United States Congress. So I would like to ask you, what do you think we could do now? What's the number one step we could take as legislators to help this issue?
Well, one, we passed the Secure Act, which holds accountable the agencies, so no longer can they lose the children, and no longer could they say, not our problem. It's devastating to hear that Chairman Smith had to call multiple times and he heard nothing back from these agencies. The other thing is we need to enforce our border. There's been this myth that somehow it's a mutually exclusive proposition to be for border enforcement and pro-migration. I don't understand that. I'm very pro both. I'm for big walls. I know walls are a cuss word these days because somehow this got political.
Yeah,
It
but you
wasn't
don't need to
political,
use
by the
wall.
way.
It's structures and cameras and drones.
It's
and
everything. It's virtual
It's technology.
walls.
It's
Yeah,
technology.
it's technology. I worked under 2 different administrations of 2 different parties on that border, and they all built more of border protection, and everyone was thumbs up about it because it rescues children. We have to explain the concept of it forces the flow of movement, children being trafficked or drugs, to a single place where dedicated women and men in uniform are trained to identify the child. Why is this so controversial? We use it everywhere we go, museums, amusement parks, concerts. It's okay for everybody else to do it, but all of a sudden it's somehow bad or racist, or I don't understand it. We're rescuing children from foreign countries. That's our goal. For 10 years as an anti-trafficking operator undercover on that border, that was my goal, to rescue children from foreign countries so they wouldn't get into the hands of our pedophiles. And so I've never understood.
Most of those kids are from Latin America.
Correct.
They belong to my region. They're Latin American kids that are being trafficked into the United States.
Correct. So let's give them the hope of one last window opportunity before they're stuck into a very dangerous situation.
So
Is
just
that port of entry?
Give me an example, a regular example of what happens with that child that is, let's say, stolen from Honduras or from Colombia.
Sure.
It winds up at our border, and then what happens when they come into the United States?
Okay, so this is an important point. I learned this from the president of Honduras last week. These kids are coming, their families are coming through, a lot of them pass through the Darien Gap, and it's a jungle,
Panama.
it's horrible. And by the time they get out and land in Honduras, the families leave their kids. They can't stand watching their kids suffer anymore. They put them in some kind of a very insecure kind of arrangement with a foster situation or something. And that's what makes them so exposed and available, the coyotes and traffickers who say, oh, it's so easy to get them at this point. They bring them up. Oftentimes they'll use these kids once they get there. And the abuse is extensive, by the way, on the way up. And once they get there, sometimes they're used as pawns. There's something called the Flores settlement, which was well-intentioned, but the traffickers are always looking to exploit even well-intentioned, in this case it was a court decision. A child with a family member must be permitted within 72 hours inside the United States. I get that. It sounds great. Except they start using these kids as pawns and pairing up false families, pairing up a child with the clients. Call this woman mom, call him dad, and you're going to get right in. Well, Border Patrol started noticing the same kids were coming in with different parents.
And no DNA testing anymore at this hour.
At the time, it was implemented. My understanding was that it was taken away. The ranking member Thompson from the hearing yesterday at Homeland Security said it is actually still there. So I'm investigating what's true about it, but it has to be implemented if it's not. And so then the child, whether they're used as a pawn in that strange loophole, eventually at any point during this process, a sponsor can call in or show up, and it's very
And
minimal.
they're picked up by the trafficker, and then what happens next?
Well, and I'll say this before that, it's more difficult to adopt a cat from a shelter, in my opinion, than getting a child out of HHS into our country. And then after that, we don't know because they won't pick the phones up. But I'll tell you what, in a country that probably has more pedophiles than any other country in terms of just sheer numbers, I base that on the fact that we consume more child exploitation material than any other country. It's very concerning. There was a case recently where 100 children were sent to the same address by HHS in San Antonio, or Austin, I believe. 100 kids to one address. I don't think that was a well-intentioned sponsor. They're going to do something with those children, whether it's slave labor, whether it's sexual exploitation. But here's the problem. Now these kids are identityless. They don't speak the language. They don't have a name, a number. They don't have any way to identify, and they're gone. And so this is our responsibility to protect these children, just like we were protecting the other
The
children.
American news media, have they been receptive to your statements? Have they called you to do interviews and put this out there in the news?
No. In fact, they just like to say things like, Mr. Ballard is wrong-headed, thinking that there's any kind of trafficking going on at the border. I mean, they make a statement like this without backing it up with anything. I don't know why they don't want to have the conversation. These are children. This is not partisan. It shouldn't be partisan. And I can't figure out why they don't want to talk about it.
These are Latin American kids.
They're Latin American children. And that's the reason I left the government, frankly, was because, as Congressman Smith knows, is because I didn't care. Human trafficking, child trafficking knows no borders and boundaries. Unfortunately, bureaucracies do. And that's why I left. I couldn't handle the bureaucracy. I couldn't handle the fact that I was told, you can save this kid, but not that kid. And so that's why I left, so that I wouldn't have any jurisdictional or bureaucratic limitations. And I wish that our policies conform to that way of thinking as well.
Of course. Human rights is across the board,
Correct.
not only for some and not for others. Thank you very much. We're going to regroup and try to, we've created this bill to find where those 85,000 kids are at. Because that, according to what your information, it was in the first 30 days of the Biden administration when the border was more opened than in the that happened during a
That's correct.
30-day period.
That's correct, and I like the idea of streamlining our immigration laws. Make it easier. I want more asylum. I want more immigrants. I suggest long term can we not put our asylum and immigration courts? This may sound like a logistical nightmare, but if we can get those as an attachment to our embassies in these Central American countries, imagine. You de-incentivize the traffickers. You suck the wind out of the sails of their criminal networks, and the honest and good people who want and need to come to the United States, make it quick, make it fast. Don't make them take a 3,000-mile journey. Let them go to the embassy and get asylum immediately, and we can help them with passage. I love this idea that I just learned about called the Central American Minors Program. How amazing. Let's help these children. Let's help them get safety. Let them have the American dream. I agree with that. I'm going to look into that, and thank you for bringing that up. I didn't know about this. So there's so many things we can do.
Thanks to you, sir. Yield back.
Thank you. Yield to the chairman of the Africa Committee, Mr. James.
I seem to think that the administration would care more about these kids if they weren't black and brown. Maybe they can prove it to us. Prove me
Yes.
wrong. As the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee, I've made ending child slave labor a top priority. In fact, my Bridge to DRC Act supports efforts to remove child and slave labor from U.S. supply chains. In addition to my amendment to H.R. 1, which would reshore critical mineral mining and refining back to the United States, the Bridge to DRC Act also goes a long way in ending child slave labor and sex trafficking. In March, I asked Secretary Blinken directly for his commitment to work with me on efforts to address the issue of slave labor during his testimony before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And we are still working with the administration on their compliance with his agreement. This is a matter of morality and critical importance, regardless of where a child happens to be born. America wants to be the shining city on the hill. They want to be the beacon of hope for the world. Well, we have to start acting, and I need your help. Can you share your assessment of the current administration's national action plan to combat human trafficking for all children, regardless of whether or not they are Ukrainian, South Sudanese, North Sudanese, Guatemalan, Venezuelan, all children? Can you give your assessment?
Well, I don't hear it very often coming out of the administration. The agencies continue to do their wonderful work. They want more resources. I've spent the last 10 years trying to get resources to law enforcement offices, state mostly because the federal government won't take our grants, so we send them to task forces. There's not enough resources. And that's been a problem in every administration, by the way. I don't think that's necessarily a new problem, but I would love to see the president talk about it all the time.
Not enough resources. So that might be an indication that that resources we do have are spread too thin. What are the initiatives or organizations that are doing a good job that should get more resources? And in your opinion, what are some organizations that seem to be a waste of time and money?
Well, I'll tell you that, in my opinion, the solution is going to be a private-public partnership. I've worked on both sides of that fence. I've been a government agent. I've worked as a private citizen. There's so many things that NGOs can do that governments can't do. And of course, there's many things, of course, that governments can do that NGOs can't do. Together, we can pretty much do everything. That was the example I gave with the operation I led out of Ukraine last year. We had, I think 5, 6 NGOs working with 6 different agencies of different governments. It's amazing. In 4 months, we were able to do that many rescues. We need a better partnership. We need to get funding, even more to the government agencies, to NGOs. NGOs are miracle workers. I'm telling you, the NGOs are the ones I'm most.
What are the barriers? Is the State Department getting in the way of the effectiveness of NGOs?
I don't know, because I'm not qualified to answer that question. I've never dealt with the State Department in terms of funding anything, but I wish they would send a lot more funding to NGOs.
This question is for the entire panel. What areas are you seeing of government inefficiency, and what areas is the American government, most notably the administration, erecting barriers to saving children? Where can Congress help tear down barriers to saving children?
Okay, well, I mean, first and foremost, I'm going to go out to the border. I'll go out to the border first. The barriers are horrifying, in my opinion, right now, simply to rescue children, meaning not enough resources are being sent to take care of those kids. We've talked about that at length, I think, already today. So that's the first thing, and that's where my focus is. My expertise isn't as much inside the United States or on the aftercare side in terms of getting grants, getting money, but I do know this, that the NGOs that I work with, that I'm most impressed with, are way underfunded, especially because of the inflation and economic problems. Donations are down. I wish the U.S. government would rely more on private groups and NGOs who, in my opinion, have probably the most expertise in them. And there's so many organizations now over the last 10 years that I've been so impressed with, and I just wish we could get, that's the Spear Fund's whole model that I advise on, is finding organizations, aftercare and rescue intervention, and get them the resources they need. And I think the U.S. government should put more faith in NGOs.
Agreed. Mr. Chairman, I am a father first. I'm an elected official second. And when I think of child trafficking, only 2 words come to mind: pure evil. It's unconscionable, and I think that we all agree that someone could do this to a child. We talk about demon possession being relegated to the past, most notably our Bible stories, but I'll tell you, the battle is not in the physical world, and these people who perpetrate this evil on children are demon possessed, and we must make sure that we eradicate to the best of our ability any barrier that comes between saving children's lives and the platform that we have today. So I know my time is limited. I wish we could get to more questions, but I appreciate you all being here today, sharing your personal stories, and please count on me as an ally to support in any way that you possibly can, or we possibly can.
If I may, Representative, to respond to your question too, I think, thinking about when we do give aid to other countries and the programs that Department of State or USAID are implementing, I really think focusing them on youth protection, right, and gender-based violence, those have been key drivers and root causes of what we've seen, both children having to flee in the first place, and also, areas in where there could be a lot of prevention and protection for children. So I think when we're looking at the programs that we're funding, making sure that there's a real eye to youth protection, centering it on those principles, and also in gender-based violence, I think we can go a long way to prevention, which is what we all want in the first place, so no child ever has to experience any of these harms.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think really, like, wait, there's a lack is the screening process. When you have children who show up, you know, on our borders, and there's no tracking system from origin country to the destination country. As you talked about, this is where we miss many children, because if they're not being tracked, if there's a screening system where that says you from this place and you being placed from this place. One thing I can share with you really quick is that right after the Rwandan genocide, my siblings were given to random people who have never been vetted. There was no social workers to follow up. They could have been dead. Nobody would have asked questions. When I was a 10-year-old, I was put into a place, I had my first job as a 10-year-old. The woman abused me at every level. Nobody would have asked questions. But if there was that tracking system that this child, this orphan is placed in this home, and this person has gone through the background check, I think that would be great. The other thing that I believe that we need to really have a place and a platform for survivors to be part of decision making, because I think those voices are lacking. I think we have survivors come and maybe give a talk and so forth, but I think they need to be part of the decision making as well, to be hired in the decision making. Also, trauma informed is something that most people don't talk about. Not anybody could just deal with somebody who has survived this kind of trauma. People need to be trained on trauma informed on how to address these issues. My last request would be really to have businesses, schools, and the airport to have where there's a post that says, gives information on how to report human trafficking. Because individuals who are coming in and do not have information, that really puts them at a higher risk. Thank you.
Okay, I think that we are going to try to show a video quickly of an example that we got from Rep. Oh, this is later? All right, well, I'll just say this. For whether or not we're dealing with votes right now, I think we need to get going. But from what I'm hearing, very helpful. NGOs are extremely impactful because they have the accountability, transparency, and focus on outcomes that it does not seem the federal government is acquainted with, and we should support those initiatives. Also, trauma-informed treatment and processes for lessons learned and gender-based violence and a focus there. That's extremely helpful, and I appreciate your feedback. Thank you for your time today. Mr. Chairman, are you back?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As we leave, we are late for a vote, and I think we'll make it. But just very briefly, thank you, Ms. Lakin, for bringing up the issue of organ harvesting. For 3 years, I tried to get a bill passed to stop organ harvesting. It was bipartisan. Matter of fact, Ms. Manning is one of the co-sponsors on the bill. It passed 413 to 2. It's sitting over in the Senate now for 6 months, and I can't get it out on the floor for a vote. So, and it has real penalties for those who, with intent, procure forced organ harvesting organs. It focuses absolutely on China, but the rest of the world would be covered by this legislation, and we can't get it out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I thank you again for your extraordinary testimonies, and we are adjourned. Real quick with a picture.
Doing that to show me to shut up.